Good day, everybody. Today we have Dominique Deltiel here. He is from Montpellier in France. You might have read his bio already on the internet. Dominique was working as scientific director of the ICV for 20 years. In 2005 he started his own consulting company and is consulting worldwide in different parts of the wine industry. And to make a long story short, Dominique brings a lot of knowledge to the table, which will discover today. And so I don't want to hold you up. Let's start this seminar and keep you going.
Thank you, Matthias. Good morning. Bonjour. As Canada is bilingual, bonjour. But I think here most people speak English. So. Always glad to exchange some of my experience in research development and practice in consultancy with students and winemakers. And my topic today is winemaking technique to maximize fruit retention and color stability. Personally, I prefer this title, winemaking good practices. Good practices is a general method in the food industry and other industries. And I think I was one of the first to introduce that concept to wine, at least in Europe. And I prefer that, and because good practices is the up-to-date combination of science, research development, full-scale trials, and validation of those techniques. What for? To reach a goal. Good practices is to reach a goal. It's different from science or more academical research. So good practices to build, because winemaking is working, to build a fruity balanced wine to reach market segment goals with a confirming longevity. And longevity is very important, and we'll talk about that. So if we talk about good practices, as I said, they are winery technique to reach a market goals. So very general vision of which are the successful wines around the world today. Something I like in the good practices method is you don't say I like this wine or not. It's better to leave that to consumers, but to say is the one confirming to the goals in the green area, like the traffic light. Then orange zone is wines that are limit to the goals, and red zone is the danger zone, because wines that are not confirming to the goals. And there are three general axes that are very important: clean and sound. Makes sense, but never forget it. Some people live in nature, ferment their wines, etc. Biogenic amines are not very clean and sound for consumers. Be careful with that, don't forget it. Not only the 90s or the 80s, big problem in Austria with diethyl glycol or methanol in Italy or Argentina. Don't forget that. Yeah? Clean and sound, it's always something winemaker has to keep in mind for consumers. Confirming longevity, that's very important. I will develop that. And wine without aggressivity. Of course, aggressivity is a relative word, but consumers may like big tannin wines in certain occasions, but not if the consumers consider them aggressive. Okay, so number one axis, and very important, and on which I work much, is longevity. As I said, I'm old enough now to know what longevity is. And in research development, when I was in ICV, there was something, key point in the work. And as I said, once at least I had a good idea, was to keep experimental wines for 5 or 10 years when we were at ICV, and to taste the wine after 5 or 10 years. So we discovered some elements nobody talked about that had an influence after 5 years or after 10 years. So very important to build the right longevity. So my definition of longevity first is the period during which the wine is confirming to the market goals, market style, market goals. So in case of red wine is to keep a certain color, and also with that definition, the period during which the wine is confirming to the goals, the wine has to start being confirming. So the young wine need to be confirming to the market, etc. So longevity is not, when I start talking about longevity, some people say, longevity is not important. All my wines are sold in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. Yes, but the last bottle has to be good and still confirming. And some wine, it's not easy at all to get a wine, for example, lifestyle Sauvignon, to avoid atypical aging in some areas. and to be still with the right fruit and the right balance after 1 year or two, especially if you have white glass, neons in the supermarkets, warm temperature in the supermarkets. Ontario is not maybe a big problem for Ontario exporting. When you're Australian, Chilean, most of your 99% of your wines travel more than 10,000 kilometers. You don't know how many times crossing the equator, etc., etc. So longevity is not the concept of, okay, the French guy will tell us how a Bordeaux chateau is still good after 30 years. No, this is a niche. Today I'm talking about segments. So longevity is relative to your market. Sauvignon Blanc, let's say $10 to $15 retail will be 1-2 years. Not all wines around the world in that segment are with the right longevity. And if you talk a big Cabernet, 5 to 10 years longevity will be something we need to, because leaders on the market have the right longevity. Okay, so back to the general axis to build the consistent and confirmed longevity. That is the key point. The colloidal matrix, sufficiently concentrated, balanced, and stabilized. That is, for me, everything is explaining that. Okay, that's a big sentence. Talking about reds, I don't start with high enough polyphenol concentration, because research development and practice has shown that it's the general colloidal matrix that is more important than just polyphenol themselves, and because everything is interacting. So let's see different point to build that colloidal matrix, sufficiently concentrated, balanced, and stabilized. We are talking about good practices, so at the right cost, to get the right price and the right margin. We are talking about wine industry. We are not talking about science. So everywhere, and any time behind that, there's a consumer one day that we hope will put some dollars on the table to drink the wine. And another thing, never to forget, consumers, they buy the wine. Today I'm paid by the wine. Don't know, people working are paid by the wine. Consumer, they pay for the wine. Never forget that. And journalists generally don't pay the wine, so they can talk about the wine. Consumers, they pay the wine and they like to drink it, not just to smell and talk. Okay, so that said, let's go on. Very important, I put them in order of importance today, and more experience is going. More I introduce new elements in that and rebalance the factors. First key point, the right pH in the juice and the wine. I heard you had some very warm vintage to your average climate. Change in the pH is a very important thing. Be careful. Some areas around the world, the pH rose from 0.3, 0.4 than compared with 20 years ago. 2% more alcohol, and winemakers go on doing the same wine making, and then they have struct fermentation, they have Brettanomyces, they have flat, soapy wines, and they say, well, consumers around the world don't appreciate our wine anymore. Yeah, you change your wine. Your terroir may be and you think your terroir is the same. No, the climate has changed, and the general climate is part of the terroir. Anyway, so talking about pH, be careful. A very powerful motor for the colloid balance. That's why I put it in first place, the most powerful. Second, sufficient concentration with macromolecules from grape, yeast, bacteria, and oak. Different moment, generally in the order of appearance in the winemaking. 3, right concentration with compounds that participate to different families of aroma and the right interaction with macromolecules. Often interactions are more important for sensory expression than the molecular concentration itself. If you go to my website, there's a work we did with the INRA in Montpellier, in the University of Montpellier, when I was in ICV, showing the impact of yeast monoproteins on the volatility and the sensory expression of some molecules. With and without interaction with monoprotein from yeast, some molecules, volatility and sensory expression change by more than 60%. So often the molecular concentration, if you have 33% more of this, if it's not in the right interaction, the sensory impact maybe will be less important than a different concentration but with the right interactions. When I said different families of aromas, very important also in the good practices is start to avoid the known mistakes. That also my good practices in consulting. When I start with a winery I don't know, a terroir I don't know, I start to figure what are the key elements and to avoid the non-mistakes. Generally, it's the best way to go ahead. We don't know what is exactly the recipe to make the right wine, but if we start to avoid non-mistakes, and the mistakes, non-mistakes is a very long list, then we start to reach generally confirming wines. Okay, so remember here, this slide is the right concentration with compounds that participate to different families of aroma. Let's manage those already 5 families of aroma at each moment of winemaking, and hoping this balance will go on in the bottle or in the bag-in box or in your flex tank if you're exporting in bulk. So, sulfur-like aroma and taste. Very important, taste. Often people talk about sulfur aromas. All the molecules impacting aromas on the olfaction, like this. When you smell the wine, that's olfaction, and then retroolfaction in your mouth. All the molecules have an impact on the mouth. That's easy to understand. In the glass or in our mouth at 37 centigrade, none of the so-called volatile compounds are 100% volatile. So a good part stays, usually most of it, in solution in the wine. So they interact with your mucuses, with your saliva. So it's very well known that sulfur compounds impacting sulfur-like aromas have an impact on taste. Generally metallic, bitter. Be careful. Chemical and solvent-like aromas and taste, tutti frutti, descriptor, beer-like aroma, etc. Herbaceous and vegetal-like aromas and taste, those we have to manage. Be careful. Fruit and spices-like aroma and taste. Consumers generally like a balance with that and not too much of this. And also here from herbaceous fruit and burning, cooked or pharmaceutical-like aroma and taste, here will be some people that make confusion between ripe and overripe. Some people, I remember when I made many conferences on berry tasting and berry ripening and phenolic ripening, people, what is the optimum? No, it's a balance. And more is not always the good solution. So keep the balance between those things. Of course, then, that is the statement. Some important consideration. Fruity and spicy-like aroma and taste, balance acidity, roundness and length, can express and last, so the longevity, only if the 3 other aromatics families, that means sulfur, herbaceous, chemical, and pharmaceutical cooked burned, those 4 families are at enough low molecular concentration in enough intense interaction with macromolecules. So not expressing too much. If you have a wine smelling like first garlic for sulfur, then pharmaceutical like syrup for the sore throat, then smelling like cut fresh asparagus and tutti frutti, generally you don't have real fruit behind that. And talking about sensory analysis, the words are convention. So when I say fruit, generally fruit and spice, when you taste, on my website you have the description of the method I'm using, it's published. Fruit and spice, you can tell, put a name on the fruit. For young generation, Red Bull aroma or burn, whatever, making advertising or on those beverage. I don't know any tree or bush producing a fruit smelling like that. Or for older people, tutti frutti bubblegum, it's the chewing gum industry ideas of fruit, not a real fruit. And in wine, if you have a tutti frutti wine or Red Bull aroma, it's not fruit, so it comes for me in the family of chemical. I heard some, and the mistake to avoid, I heard some winemakers say, yeah, but young generation, we have to think about them, of course. They are not very rich today, but they will become consumers. Let's hope one day. So people are used to and they like Red Bull, but you never compete with wine against Red Bull but vodka. So wine has to be a certain balance, change through years because the consumers' ideas of wine and taste are changing. Be careful to, let's say, cover or justify lack of vision and style to say, oh, okay, my Red Bull aroma. No, I would describe it as a chemical, burning and bitter in the finish are okay because on the market those aromas are common. Be careful. Okay. The compounds that may participate to fruit and spicy aroma are in enough intense interaction with macromolecules and at least already present, of course, in the wine. Manage pH. Tartaric acid immediately in the fresh grapes, if needed. If your grapes is not coming to the winery talking. This introduction is also true for whites, 99% of the works. If your grape doesn't come at the crusher with the right balance, right pH balance level, tartaric acid immediately in the fresh grapes. No, the most efficient, and eliminate the potassium that is in excess. Some countries, when I talk about that, immediately comes the question on lactic or malic. Okay, you see, these are my good practices from research development and experience. And don't listen to trendy talks about malic and lactic. When it comes to manage pH, if we are talking about 1 month from bottling, rebalancing a wine like a cook, salt and pepper, etc., a little bit of citric, malic, lactic, make your trials. Why not? Why not? To change the taste and the balance of the wine once your pH has been reached. To change the pH, especially in some areas around the world, to reach, we'll be talking about Pinot Noir, to reach what for me, the right pH for maceration, 3.3, maximum 3.4, you need 3 grams of tartaric acid per kilo. So when it's massive acidification in some areas, that is necessary. Tartaric is by far the most interesting. So let's go on the strategy. So remember, manage right pH, the right balance of macromolecules. So take interesting macromolecules and anticipate next slide. Do not eliminate interesting macromolecules. And avoid extracting not interesting macromolecules or macromolecules combination. So enough ripening, maturity of grape cells, walls, aroma, pigments, tannin, interaction with grape polysaccharides, and enough maceration. Very quickly, tannin interaction with grape polysaccharides. That is, I said, good practices is the combination of up-to-date science, research development, and practice. And with the work made by the INRA in Montpellier and the University in Adelaide in Australia, they have shown, and for me it's very consistent with practice in research development, that the so-called tannin ripening, when you taste the grapes, you see it, you taste that the berry taste is changing, the so-called the tannin-like sensation, the tannicity, whatever, tannic intensity is changing, and during the ripening of the grapes. Apparently, it's more the interaction between the tannin molecules with polysaccharide that explain the change during ripening, because the tannin molecular structure are not changing that much, or almost not changing during ripening. That was not what was said in the past, but personally I would trust more what Véronique Chénier is saying that what some people said in the 70s. Okay, enough ripening, grape cells, very important for grape macromolecules. Right yeast strain and right inactive yeast at the right moment, including after membrane treatment, if you work with membrane treatment, cross-flow filtration, electrodialysis, etc. Right lactic acid bacteria, very important. Right oak at the right dosage, at the right moment, starting with fresh grapes. Be careful here, I said fresh grapes, not fresh oak, because I will talk about that later in the example. Very important. Let's take from grape, yeast, bacteria, and oak interesting macromolecules, but do not eliminate the interesting ones. So be careful with excessive maceration or oak for too much time, especially during aging. They may destabilize interesting macromolecule complexes. When you have your color precipitating at the bottom of the tank, it's not just anthocyanins precipitation, you also precipitate other complex. Be very careful with excessive findings. Findings is still an maybe interesting technique. Be careful. Some books, some practices, some habits. We always did that. Yeah, but your grapes have changed, market have changed. Practices on okay, let's extract as much as possible things. Then we clean that with gelatin, eggs, etc., eggs white. That's not clearly with that sentence not good practices. I think to build longevity. Be careful. Okay, some people say, oh, French, you will talk about fresh oak, intense findings, etc. Okay, I'm French, but that's not at all my good practices. Do not use, you see, copper sulfate or copper citrate. They are fruit killers. Tell me how an ion that is able to cut and hydrolyze and destroy different molecules is just focusing on your H2S. No, one, this is in vitro vision, in simple 2 molecules with 3 atoms vision. Wine matrix is much more complex, and copper sulfate is killing your fruit, and it's talk about Pinot Noir, that's a terrible technique. I said copper sulfate and copper citrate. Copper integrated into yeast, it's another story. Maybe I'll talk about that when we talk about the practical example. Work with membrane as soon as possible. If you are on a process with membrane, cross-flow filtration, electrodialysis, etc. The goal, work as soon as possible to early balance the wine and be able to start again aging with the right inactive yeast and the right oak. That is, today we are not like, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, oh, I need to clean my wine from that small negative lees, or I need to stabilize it because I have some bread, Pediococcus, lactobacillus presence in my wines, etc. But if I clean the wine through centrifuge and then directly cross flow, then I don't add any more lees because aging is not finished. Today there are interesting inactivity yeasts that allow to work early with membrane. That's very positive, and start the right aging. There's one country where Tempranillo comes at the crusher for pH 4. If you don't change the pH as I recommended at the end of malolactic, you're 4.2 pH. So it's not a bad idea to add some tartaric to manage some pH during fermentation, and then as soon as possible, as soon as malolactic is finished, cross-flow filtration, electrodialysis to bring it to a more acceptable aging pH like 3.6, 3.7. And with Tempranillo in some areas with acidic soils, just tartaric acid, it's almost impossible. You have to work also with that and electrodialysis, for example, to get to a decent pH and a certain balance, unless you want to sell gritty, soapy, dirty bitumen. Okay. And if you think this is okay, Rioja, big wineries are present on the market for 50 years, and they have their own communication on that. Okay, other interesting axes are important. Eliminate potassium and calcium as soon as possible. So pH membrane, resin, or electrolysis, according to your country, what is allowed or not, your style, etc. Potassium has a bitter negative impact. And that's also a big interest of tartaric acid. It's the only acid when you have to make acidification that is tartaric is active on the pH change because it's combining and eliminating physically potassium through the crystals. Absorption as soon as possible of compounds that participate to defects, to faults, sulfur, herbaceous, chemical, cooked pharmaceutical. For example, inactivated yeast, especially inactivated yeast with very interesting absorption capacity, with segmented fractionated addition, starting early during vinification and aging, as soon as those elements and their correlated mouthfeel, fault, metallic, bitterness for sulfur, herbaceous, those green-like tannin sensation. I won't talk about tannin sensation later when we talk about practice. I would say tannin-like sensation, because many molecules that are not at all tannins have an impact on the tannin intensity, astringency, dryness, and bitterness. So molecules participating to herbaceous aroma give so-called green tannin-like sensation. Chemical giving flat, soapy for mouth. That is not volume. A flat, soapy solvent character for mouth. This is not volume for me. This is solvent aggressive character. Many of the compounds participating to chemical aroma push the bitterness. In cooked pharmaceutical, the same thing. So as soon as those elements are work on them. There's not only one way, not only this, can be also during maceration, we talk about that. More oxygen. If you have sulfur-like aromas during maceration, a little more oxygen, but up to where? Oxygen is just working indirectly or on different reaction. Inactivated yeast has a direct absorbing effect on some of those elements. And in the last 5 years, from my point of view, that those inactivities that you can use at different moments is real new technique, real new tools to work on that. And on that sentence, what is important is work as soon as possible. Absorption. Oak also is working in absorption. So as soon as possible. Don't wait until things are stabilized in the colloidal matrix, because they will be more difficult to reach and to balance, to treat. Other interesting axes for me in good practices. Avoid the 4 mistakes of micro-oxygenation. Don't believe with that slide that I'm against micro-oxygenation. I'm against nothing. Things are interesting or not in the good practices. I recommend every winery around the world making white and red, especially reds, to be equipped with flexible medias to work on macro and then micro-oxygenation. I know micro-oxygenation research development now 20 years. 92 I started the first trial. So I know that, and I strongly recommend the winery to be equipped. And, as I said in the introduction, avoid the 4 main mistakes. Too much oxygen, too much time, too late during the life of wine, too much contamination. Then, on the case of our Pinot Noir, I'll give you some ideas. Okay, so just to go back on the 3 axes, because then I talk about A, B, and C. So clean and sound, confirming longevity without aggressivity. Parentheses, in the good practices, sometimes I talk about very simple things, very simple elements. If I talk about them today with my long experience, if you don't respect that, you go into trouble. And the market, internationally, wine market is tough enough not to a winery to go directly, personally to trouble. Competition is already something difficult to manage, so go ahead. Okay, so let's see a vinification strategy. We've seen the different axes, the different elements, the toolbox, what we have to go through, different objectives. Now let's see more precisely the toolbox, what we need to do to reach the longevity, color stability, etc. for red wine. So winemaking goals and main risks management to reach the main market goals A, B, and C. So taking fruit aroma from pulp and skin. International market today, it's better to have some fruit aromas in your grapes. If not, you're on the you start on the wrong way for international competition. Parentheses, I talk about international market also to have a more global vision. I think I'm not local, so that's also what I can bring to you. In some countries, some people say, yeah, but I don't export. And yes, but consumers may import. So international market is not looking just to export, but also to prevent your local market from importation or compete with imported wine. Okay. So, taking fruit aromas from pulp and skin, pigments, polysaccharides from pulp and skin, hydrosoluble tannin from the skin. Pulp, pulp, pulp. In research, polyphenols, tannins, pigment specialists or specialized lab can just look at the skin because it's what's richer. Winemaker, you have to work with the pulp. And the pulp is very interesting from fruit aromas and polysaccharides, etc. Okay, not extracting herbaceous aromas and aggressive tannins in the inner layer of the skin. 99.9% of the grapes around the world has some of herbaceous risks somewhere. So even the very ripe grapes, very balanced. Be careful with that. And extracting as few as possible ethanol soluble tannins. We'll see the strategy to reach that. Here we are more on the winemaking direct goals. Let's go on. Avoiding sulfur-like of flavors and odors. They amplify herbaceous and aggressive sensation on the nose and mouth. Metallic taste and bitterness. I already talked about that. The lowest efficient level of SO2 before fermentation. Some winemakers say, oh, SO2 is cheap, so I can use a little more, it's more secure, etc. No, be careful. It's a very powerful element in the balance, not only on sulfur-like of flavors, of odors, and of taste, but also many different things. Very well-known mistakes to avoid. More SO2 in your juice, more the yeast is producing acetaldehyde. More, it will be difficult to manage your molecular free total SO2 balances. Okay. Right protection and nutrition of the yeast during fermentation to avoid this. The yeast is the main engine for production of sulfur problems. The right oxygenation program during maceration and the right program of racking agitation during aging to be careful on the development of sulfur compounds and sulfur-like of flavors during aging. When I talk about longevity and color, a simple proof to demonstrate that yeast may have, I'm not saying this is exactly what happens in every winemaking, but something that today, as I will be talking talking about Pinot Noir, that's my example, here it's on Grenache. Grenache and Pinot Noir are very different, but they have the common problem of color intensity and color stability. So, good Côte du Rhône grapes from 97, and picture, one of the last picture, the ICV I took in 2004. This, don't ask me, was it made exactly the same? I will be a little offense because it was the experimental winery in ICV that is working with good practices for experimental wineries. So everything was exactly the same. The only difference was the yeast ICVD 254, and here in Canada I should not have to translate, you know French. So, translation, low price yeast. Exact translation is yeast with the lowest first price. The lower price. Okay, so look, that not people to argue, yes, maybe the light was coming from there or there. There's less wine in this glass than in this one. It was made on purpose. And you see the difference? And clearly, not only the color difference, I hope you can see that. If not, you will have problem in balancing your color for your consumers. Consumers see the difference between that. Some people say, yes, it's not what I would expect. Okay, that's a big difference. And here, that was a good Côte du Rhône village, 7 years in the bottle, well developed with classical raspberry jam. And here it was the low price aged Côte du Rhône you find in supermarkets in France at €2.99. That would be for $4.59 or $450. So that was not expressing the terroir at all. This was a more Grenache the way it was looking for. Okay, in my long career in teaching and training people, talking about good practices, very important as I finished that part. Talking about the goals, general goals, imbalance, etc. Winemaking goals, not extract this, be careful with that, etc. And then apply those general elements, the goals and the toolbox, to an example. So this is the example of today, to respect time. I have chosen Pinot Noir. One example, this example with today to reach the international market for Pinot Noir. For me, good practices, so practices that are consistent with the goals. So I've taken an example, full-bodied Pinot Noir with barrel aging, let's say retail price $30, $35. When we talk about good practices, there are techniques that are adapted to reach the goal in longevity, fruit, color stability, etc., and style, of course, and also at acceptable costs. Okay, if we were in Argentina in an area with 10 million or more liter wineries fermenting in 1 million liter tanks, people thinking in hectoliters, 10,000 hectoliter, I would have chosen another example because they say, oh, Pinot Noir is not for them, but also with costs acceptable for them. So I want, it's always, when we talk about technique, is it acceptable or not? Here with full-bodied Pinot Noir aged with barrel, 30, 35. If you are 50, it applies too. Then some costs are justified because they participate to reaching the goals and or avoid known mistakes. Okay. So, through my long years of research development, I will talk about some techniques and some products. Not because today I'm sponsored by Lalma, because there are things that I tried and they were validated from my research development and practice to reach those goals, not because just to talk about them. Very important in red wine making, temperature management. We've called pre-fermentative maceration. Around the world, Pinot Noir that has the right level in the grape quality, so sound, $35 if you are not sound, you're out of the market immediately. Sound, ripe, etc. So generally, 99.9% of around the world, this Pinot Noir will be over 13.5% alcohol potential, and pH will be higher than 3.5. Okay, so temperature. So these grapes deserve or merit or are okay for a cold pre-fermentation maceration. Very quick parenthesis. I mean, many parentheses. I personally consider around the world too many winemakers apply cold pre-fermented maceration because it's trendy. In some countries, it's just a trend. It's trendy, so winemakers do that. Or I've seen that winery around here in France, Italy, or California, they do that. Apply to my grapes without considering it. Okay, be careful with cold pre-fermentative maceration. If we are talking about a $15 retail Pinot Noir, easy to drink, etc., the grapes we won't do cold pre-fermented maceration because it will be too expensive, and the grapes won't be better with pre-fermentation. Okay, that grapes is okay for that. Classical, you don't need to be cooler than that. 4 or 5 days, no more. Again, why not? Then the big problem during pre-fermentative maceration is to manage Cloacara picaritidis, Cloacara and Saniaspora. So more than 5-6 days, even with the technique we talk next slides, you come into risks. And ethyl acetate is not what general people are looking for expensive wines. So be careful with that. So 4 or 5 days, no more. And from fruit point of view, it's far enough with the old technique we'll see to get the efficiency of cold soak or pre-fermentative maceration. I prefer pre-fermentative maceration because we'll be working. Cold soak, I don't know if people invented that word, give the impression, okay, you cool your grapes and that's it. No, we apply a certain temperature to do some actions. We work during this period. Not just look at the tank and say, oh, I'm an high-end winery because I made cold soak. No. Pre-fermentative maceration. Okay, then we go to, for me, very classical for Pinot Noir, 20 centigrade. And then I've taken the example. I'm not saying it's the only solution, the only possibility, but let's say some extended maceration, less 4 or 5 days. Okay, sorry, this is bricks. So the fermentation curve. And this is the temperature, so we'll finish to 18 centigrade because we'll be looking for malolactic. SO2, I put that on that slide, 2-3 gram per hectoliter, no more. We are going to talk soon about pH adjustment. Let's go. So pH adjustment is next slide. Yeast protection and nutrition strategy. Okay, some people say with those temperature, fermentation is very easy. Some area around the world, that conference will be talking about 15% alcohol potential Pinot Noir. So fermentation is easier than classical Bordeaux Cabernet fermentation at 35. That's not what I would recommend. Here we are relatively, from temperature point of view, favorable fermentation, but we have the difficultness to ferment. So very important, some yeast that are now some years, almost 20 years around the world, very interesting yeast to develop Pinot Noir characteristics. Here we are higher end rich Pinot Noir, so this strain is very interesting. If you have a lighter style Pinot Noir and you apply this process, those two yeasts are more interesting than this one. Okay, some people say, oh, this is a yeast for white wine. Yes, but it works very well in the mid-bodied Pinot Noir. Okay, the yeast, on that graph I will remind things that are very important for any kind of fermentation, and also for Pinot Noir. We need a young yeast population in good physiological state, so good health. A good healthy yeast is the only possibility to get an old, here when fermentation finishes, an old still active population. Some winemakers that start to say, okay, I start to take care of the yeast because their sulfur flavor fermentation is slowing down after halfway through fermentation. This is a big mistake. Old cells do not react anymore, and many problems occur, sulfur flavor, VA, etc., during the young, when the yeast strain is a young population. So, summary, Many actions even before fermentation starts. Here, even before we want some fermentation. Why inoculate your Saccharomyces immediately on the fresh crushed grapes with pH adjusted? Note, on grapes, hectoliter is 100 kilo of grapes. On juice, hectoliter is 100 liter. Okay, so here, immediate inoculation of yeast is to get a positive fight, biological fight, against apiculated yeast, Ancinaspora and Cloacera, because the yeast here, your Saccharomyces aptensi, won't be actively fermenting, but already sucking the vitamins and the minerals, etc., and occupying the media from the ecosystem, that's ecology, so blocking or preventing the growth of Cloacera. Cloacera and Ancinaspora, in 30 years experience and 23 years research development, and never find let's say a clue or an element to understand the level of risks. Bacteria, indigenous Saccharomyces, yes. Hygiene, temperature, time, etc. Cloacera and Ancinaspora, they are not random, but have no, I must say it, no idea when and how they are more frequent than not, than the contrary. So be very careful. So consider you may always have a risk, even if you are very clean and picked, etc. You apply all the good practices. You're not sure with 4 or 5 days pre-fermentative fermentation. If you don't inoculate your Saccharomyces, you're not sure you manage your apiculated yeast. And ethyl acetate, $35. Ethyl acetate, $3.5. It's the same style, same aromas, same burning finish. Be careful. Like some people, oh, I like a little bit of this or that. If you're expensive wine with standardizing aroma and taste, be careful because it's the same taste, high price or lower price. And ethyl acetate is completely covering your real fruit from your good Pinot Noir. Okay. So as we inoculate it, we're inoculating our Saccharomyces here on the fresh crushed distem grapes. We prepare for fermentation with what Allemand calls protection. Nutrition by itself are elements that go into the metabolism of the yeast. As this technique and this product is added during the hydration in water, transferring sterols directly, that's been demonstrated by common research Allemand and the INRA in Montpellier, Jean-Michel Salmon, have been directly integrating sterols to the yeast membrane. So it's not coming into the classical metabolism, so it's called protection. It's also transferring some macro elements, etc. Very interesting to prevent sulfur-like of flavor. I hope you remember that prevention of sulfur-like of flavor is important, so it's also participating to that because the yeast is in a better state. It's a pure yeast product. Then at the beginning of maceration, we want to extract, we are not just looking at the cold tank, we want to work and extract what is extracted from the pomace, the juice, without alcohol, so the clearly hydrosoluble elements. That's why we are doing pre-fermentative maceration, not just to talk to the magazine and say, wine magazine, oh, I do cold soak, oh, you are a good winery. No, we are extracting things. So what we are extracting, pigments, some tannins, etc. We want to stabilize them. And this inactivated yeast is very interesting to immediately stabilize those elements and also to participate, remember, colloidal matrix from yeast, etc. At this moment, the living yeast is not growing much, so population is rather low. So the peak of monoprotein glucane that the yeast will be releasing is during this phase. So the addition of this inactivated yeast, very interesting enological strain prepared a certain way, is interesting right at this moment. Okay. Then fermentation will be started because we'll leave the temperature rise to 20, or we warm up the juice if you're in a very cold moment. Then, very important, very interesting in color, stability, style, and longevity of all reds, and particularly with Pinot Noir, is the co-inoculation. Yeast, here at this moment, and then as soon, you see here, will be the moment as soon as the cap is formed. So, from Briggs' point of view, -1, when the cap is formed. Why? When the cap is formed, that means that the yeast population inoculated has reached 20, 30 million per milliliters. So they have combined the SO2. And those yeasts that are favorable to bacteria already has given some elements that the bacteria like for their acclimatation. Of course, we want malolactic once the alcoholic is finished. But the co-inoculation is a very interesting technique and a bit very simple. All the winery I'm working with in consultancy on Pinot Noir, after one trial, generally 100% of the Pinot Noir made in winery where I'm consulting are working with co-inoculation. It's not the case for other varieties. Other varieties, some winemakers stay with post-alcoholic bacteria inoculation. Okay, so co-inoculation is very interesting, very important. Next week, no, at the end of this week, on Thursday in Virginia, the Winery Limited, we presented the conference on co-inoculation. So I guess it will be somewhere on their side, conference, if you want to go more in details on the co-inoculation. Again, when we have higher than 14% alcohol potential Pinot Noir, another very important element to go on the strategy to get a healthy young yeast population, an addition of a pure organic, it's called O for that, nutrient, only yeast, made of yeast, different fractions of yeast. Very interesting. At that moment, the yeast do not need ammonia. There's enough. If the yeast needs some, there's always enough in the juice. So often too much. Anyway, so organic nitrogen, and then nutrition. Yeast nutrition is not just nitrogen. On the university, or it's easy to talk about nutrition. Nitrogen and the simpler molecule DAP, ammonia. The yeast needs many elements, so a yeast is bringing all the amino acids the yeast is needing. Also fatty acids, steroids, etc., and also some detoxification. Yeah. All the yeast products also have a detoxification, if needed, impact. Because if some molecules are able to fix on Saccharomyces, it's better that they fix on inactivated, so dead cells, rather than on the living one. Okay, so beginning if alcohol is lower than 14, you don't add your this nutrient at this moment, you just add this one. Then the very classical demonstration, early 84, remember, by Jean-Marie Sablerol, the refueling, that's not the way he speaks, he's scientist, speak like refueling, nutrition at 1/3 of fermentation, the optimum for to the adult population to have it going on and finishing fermentation. So complex nutrient with inactivated yeast and some salt to finish fermentation. Some wineries prefer to work 2 times with this one. Depends first trial, if you want to apply this procedure, try this, and then if you 100% of your fermentation finished exactly like the way you want in 10 years, then if you know your fermentation ability, then you can go to 2 times this one. Sensory speaking, it's more interesting, but here also it's prevention of it's public conference. When I know exactly the history of fermentation problem in winery and things are going well, we go with 2 times this one rather than this one plus this one. But this is more secure. Then fermentation goes on. From sensory point of view, I already talk about this inactivated yeast, a strain I developed and for 15 years demonstrated to be the most interesting for aging, etc. On a big Pinot Noir that deserve a cold soak, then an extended maceration, Pinot is a rather harsh tannin-like sensation variety. So, and always it's difficult to manage some sulfur aromas, some earthy. So most of the time we need to start adding a yeast here that will detoxify to help finishing the fermentation if needed, and also start to balance the colloidal matrix. Okay, so I talked about copper. You apply all this procedure, we'll talk about oxygenation, we talk about agitation, etc. Sometimes, although everything is going apparently well, you have more sulfur flavor than we would like. This is a yeast with copper integrated in it. That's it's efficient and soft from action of copper, very interesting. So sometimes with some wineries, Northern Italy, I work with 6 wineries producing Pinot Noir in this segment. They don't apply exactly this process. It depends on the tank, etc. But this year, in 50% of the tanks, between the draining and the 2 quick rackings needed before malolactic, we needed to add a little bit of this. If you go on Lalma internet site, you tap this. Dosage recommended is 10 to 20 grams. That's when you have a massive bad sulfur of flavor. Here, if you are more mineral, more vegetal than you want, you make a trial in the glass. The first time you make it overnight in a bottle at this dosage, very low dosage, and you see if it ruins your fruit, you don't add it. If it cleans the aroma in the mouth and the fruit is developed, you do it right now. Don't wait. Some sentences that are big mistakes is to say some reduction. People talking like that. For me, it's already a mistake. Reduction preserved from oxidation. People talking about reduction aroma and taste. As people don't talk about millivolt, personally, I keep the word reduction when millivolt is low, when you have a redox meter, and oxidation when redox is high. Because there are many molecules that smell like garlic, etc., that are still working and are efficient, sensory speaking, negatively, at high millivolt. That means in oxidative conditions. So first, that sentence on be careful using the word reduction when you smell sulfur-like or flavor. I prefer the sulfur-like or flavor sentence, because we are not sure neither that there are only sulfur compounds participating to that. So if you have sulfur-like or flavor, don't let them, treat them immediately, but with the right intensity. Okay, I talk about OptiRed, don't have time, I go quickly. So very quickly, the schematic vision of if you have anthocyanin exposed to instability reaction with other tannins or go precipitation. Yeah? Okay. The way there, we know that macromolecules either on the surface or this it will be the big molecules would be monoprotein is even more complex than that. Polysaccharide, the scale is not respected, it's just assumed. They are able to interact with almost everything. So then they make that this is more stable than this, because, for example, if you have another anthocyanin one or already a long chain wanting to mate chemically with this molecule, they cannot come into contact. They are protected. It's something that happening in the wine. Something close to that is the copigmentation. So those interaction those come into those interactions, they are not the classical covalent links, etc. So that's one way from participating to color stability. And the last, talking about OptiRed, the last trial I tried when I left ICV was in 2005 was 98, so 7 years in the bottle trial between ICV, experimental good practices, winemaking in Merlot, with and without OptiRed. Blind taste, I said, ooh, I hope this is OptiRed, because one was sulfur, animal, vegetal, and the other one was a light style Merlot, was simple, direct. The grape were not very good. Simple, direct raspberry jam, and the clean raspberry jam was OptiRed. The control, herbaceous, vegetal, like some cheap Cabernet Sauvignon from a famous harbor on the Atlantic in France, the one you pay $2.99 in supermarkets. It was tasting like that. I mean, Bordeaux. Cheap Bordeaux are not very good wines. Be careful on that. Okay, don't copy. Oh, in Bordeaux they do this. They have problems with herbaceous, sulfur, etc. And too many people hide behind the tradition. Okay, I'll talk about delistage very quickly, because some people say, oh, I do delistage, and then they tell me what they do. So, well, you can call what you want this thing, but if you delistage is something that maybe or is efficient if it's done a certain way. So the tank, pomace, and the juice so this is a very old 95 graphs, but I keep it because it has been published, so I keep with what has been published. So when you make delistage, one thing to remember, very important in the mistake not to make, is to think that in a fermenting tank with the cap that is formed up, many people think it's homogeneous. Oh, it's so moving with fermentation. No, you have dirt, don't know in Ontario, but in Chile, California, Argentina, you have a good layer of mud, dust on the grapes. Never rain there. You have yeast. You have always some yeast. Okay, here you make sampling, you make analysis or microscope, or you have 100 millions of yeast cells, etc. But you have 1-2 centimeter of yeast settle at the bottom of the tank at the most active moment of fermentation. Then you have an mid-saturated area, and then you have an emerged part. So never seen an interest to have in a wine or in a wine system over concentrated part with under concentrated part. So it's better for stabilization, particularly with pigments and tannins, better to get that. So okay, so this is not good to stay on that. And pumping over is not really changing all this. So the delistage is very simple. You empty everything. From the lowest step you have on your tank, try to get rid of that, plus seeds, etc. So you empty everything, so you mix the different things, symbolized by that huge, this is the most important moment of delistage. That is, I call it step number 2, when the cap is touching the bottom of the tank. Once some winemaker said, I'll make delistage where I keep half a meter of juice at the bottom. Well, I don't want to hurt the cap. Okay, maybe I didn't say anything, but I did that. Means you are not understand what is delistage. This is the most interesting moment of delistage. The weight, and the only technique that does that is when you drain your cap, and you, especially in the case of your Pinot Noir, you early delistage makes early extraction of hydrophilic elements from the cap, and you not only renew your inter-berry juice but also the intra-berry juice, because we work with crushed and distilled grapes. And then here symbolize that you mix all the elements. In this is back symbolized by here. When you are traditional winery, you don't have a good flexible macro-oxygenation system. You bring your oxygen through here. You're sure with delistage, if you bring oxygen only by pumping over. I said these are all slides for delistage. Modern slides for Pinot Noir. We won't go to a bucket. We go directly to here, and there will be oxygen injection here. Okay, so close parenthesis. Here, you're sure every drop of juice has some oxygen. In a pumping over, things that, back again here, thing that many people don't know is, people know when you make a pumping over, like this, you have preferential pathway through the cap. We know that even with Chinese hat turning or whatever. There are many techniques improving that, but the juice is not homogeneous through the cap. But what many people don't know, then the juice goes to the cap, to here in a cone. This part is almost never renewed. So if you make a pumping over like 100% of the volume, some yeast go 2 times with oxygen. So I was saying, in pumping over, you are not homogeneous. So some yeast, they go several times through the circuit, and some they stay there, and you don't move the bottom of your tank. Okay. I will talk about punching down later when we see the program of delistage. So I go on the practice of delistage. So very important, I said. It's said again because it's the most important. When you drain, everything symbolized by this big drop that takes more of the polysaccharides, interesting pigments, tannins, etc. Then, when you're pumping back, as possible, don't make like tomato pulp or concentrate. Don't explode your grapes. So symbolized by this, high flow, low pressure. Okay, then according to your tank, according to your grapes, according to the vintage, maybe you have a percolation, like coffee, of your whole cap through the juice. So some people, big wineries in the 90s, when people had not equipment to make punching down, they say, with that I can make the equivalent of punching down. Again, what is interesting in delistage is not to copy punching down, it's this stage. That is the only technique that does that. Okay, so, and then symbolized by more color here and here, you may have extraction. Very important at this moment, rather than this, why not? But talking about Pinot, $35 retail Pinot Noir, there will be some punching down by hand, by machine, whatever. So this is less interesting. This, heavy lees, that should be removed. Mud, if you are we have dusty grapes, seeds, etc. Okay, strategy of maceration. We talked about early release of interesting pigments, etc., etc. Technique, answer is one: destem and crush. Okay, but this winery, they make expensive Pinot without crushing. Okay, that's another strategy, and the wine is not in that style. So, destem, crush, cool grapes, adjust pH to 3.3. Don't care about total acidity. It's not that important. Maceration enzymes on the fresh grapes. Okay, it's cold, but we have 4 or 5 days, so they will work on the macromolecules or the pulp, early release of interesting elements. Very important with Pinot Noir. Let's be simple. What's called Pinot Noir fruit is always oak and Pinot, or Pinot and oak, depends on the... And if you don't want your Pinot Noir to have, I call that cheap yogurt, vanilla plus earthy character, work with more oak early. Okay, Pinot, not because I'm French, but so-called French oak, European oak is more interesting than American oak. Chips, some people say, ooh, that's a huge quantity. That's the right quantity in that process. Toasted medium plus. Some people say, French, you will talk about bois frais. Said in French is more snobbish. Hundreds of trials, done my trials with hundreds of trials with so-called chips, staves, etc. in 91, more than 20 years. So if we talk about the fruit, the goal we were talking about, if we want to avoid chemical burning character, toasted medium plus. Okay, so delistage, if you can make that rhythm of delistage, like 1 delistage a day, see the scale, time scale, 1 delistage a day, eliminating the lees, then punching down, 2, 3, 4 punching down. If you have good grapes, delistage and punching down, almost no limit, because at the beginning you are not extracting, if you have good grapes, you're not extracting back things. Of course, we have very good grapes to make an extended maceration on Pinot Noir, not everything. And then delistage, at least some delistage, 1 day yes, 1 day no, here, when we go to the end of fermentation, eliminating the lees and the seeds, etc. That is, from delistage point of view, an interesting thing. And then we go on with 1 or 2 punching down a day. Some people say, I stop extraction here because it's too extractive. No, if you start delistage and punching down program intense at the beginning, here, okay, you have alcohol that will be helping in extraction, but your wine, here we start almost to talk about wine, is less extractive because it's already saturated in many things, from grapes, from oak, etc. So it's less extractive. That's why we crush and destem to start intense, soft, mechanically soft and chemically soft, but intense diffusion of what is interesting in the grapes. And here, during cold soak, at least 1 delistage. Some wineries on the $50, $60 bottle Pinot Noir, very well equipped, covered with CO2, make 2 to 3 delistage and some punching down, but at least 1 to eliminate dust, etc. that have become mud. That's very important for the fruit to prevent earthy character, sulfur lack of flavor, etc. And in this case, when we make a little bit 2 or 3 days of extended maceration, we drain and we rack. Here we don't have to finish alcoholic fermentation because it's finished. Oxygen. That's why I said sorry for the old graph for the delistage, because here delistage, sorry, back slide, delistage will be made with closed circuit from the fermentation tank to the reception tank and back. We don't go through a bucket to get indigenous oxygen, because with Pinot that's very interesting to have 2 to 3 here. That's the best program. 3 addition of oxygen every day at low level each time. So low level at the beginning, more because we have more tannins to work with, more maybe potential risk of sulfur flavor, etc. And then, if everything is very good, we step that. And in Pinot Noir, what's very interesting is to go on with, that's why I said, flexible media for oxygen addition. If you have a machine that you can program your additions, it's fixed, and then starting density 1020, for example, or 40 grams of sugar, you switch to continuous oxygenation, 2-3 milligram per liter per day. And then in Pinot, as soon as it's dry, generally I would recommend to stop oxygenation. Very important is agitation. Our tank so it's heterogeneous, with the green color, a certain German brand, but whatever agitator, mixer. When you make agitation, so if you make 1 delistage a day, you start with a delistage in the morning, you eliminate your heavy lees and your seeds, and then when you make agitation, symbolized by these arrows, you move your yeast, so purple arrow, and here, producing foam, it's not in white, it can be a problem. You have to manage that. In red, you just cover your cap, it's cheap, let's say punching down. And what's important is to move to have that homogeneity. That's very, very important. And agitation is very quick, very easy. So even it depends. If you make 2 punching down a day, make deep punching down. Some people say, yes, but my machine for punching down I bought 10 years ago. I thought it was interesting just to submerge the cap, not to move the lees, because in Burgundy that guy do not move the lees to protect the seeds. Okay, maybe they like earthy character and sulfur-like aromas and metallic aftertaste. Move your lees, and move your seeds. If you don't break them, no problem. We are not making 6 weeks maceration. So the agitation is very interesting to move the lees and to have homogeneity. So if you make 2 punching down, even if you make deep punching down, moving everything like that, another agitation is not bad. Generally, also, if you can program that, you make your agitation while you are making your macro-oxygenation. So agitation regularly, as soon as the cap is formed, make some agitation as well. Frankly, I'll say, talking about delistage, some winery, they start that program and they say, "Ooh, that's very much work, etc. So I don't do this and this, etc." Okay, an agitation, I haven't seen any winery trying that to stop that, because it's very, very easy. One student with low cost we can make agitation on more than 50 tanks a day. So it's very easy. It's a very good practice. Okay, draining, very quickly at the end, jump this. If you make a shorter maceration, because why not, on the $35 bottle, 70% of the tanks the process before, and if you want to keep some more fruit for the blend, if you drain and press, when you want, when before tannins become a certain structure, you drain and press with some sugar. So that racking is a key racking. 12 hours after your draining, I know it's fermenting, I know we want to keep the yeast, I know that. So 12 hours after that, you eliminate the heavy lees that are coming from the draining and the pressing, if you blend the pressing, or if you're just with drained wine. And so this racking is a key point. And then as soon as it's dry, you make this racking. This is really very important. Quickly aging. So remember, we made co-inoculation, so we need to make the malolactic. So in blue, to remember, it's not something new, it's something we already talked about. Second racking after draining. Sorry, this one. Or, sorry, this one, okay. The blue arrow is the second green arrow, okay. So let's go on agitation. We want to keep the yeast in suspension. Bacteria, they love agitation, they like it. We have a very strong tannic Pinot. If not, we don't make extensive maceration. Remember, we use 500, 700 grams of chips, etc. There's always some oak character to integrate, etc. So by experience, an early addition of this inactive yeast is very interesting, inactivated yeast. Dosage that is working well in this process. Go on agitation, so we rebalance the colloidal matrix with new yeast that is virgin to some elements that were produced during the maceration, so able to absorb, for example, aggressive tannins, etc. That is not the only recipe, but that is if you're on a very fruity, concentrated fruity Pinot Noir, interesting. Not to say I'm against malolactic in barrel, but it's to, let's say, open a door. Very interesting to make malolactic in tank with staves. That's quantity of stage that can be interesting, 300, 400 grams per hectoliter French medium plus toasted by convection. Agitation, so we wait for malolactic. Let's suppose malolactic is finished this day. The day malolactic is finished, and as we are with staves and we don't want to make barbecue with the staves, we want to use them another 2 or 3 weeks after malolactic. We want to sanitize them from our beloved VP41. So what we do, still in the tank with the staves, tartric, TH2 tartric to adjust pH to 335. SO2, we'll talk about the dosage of SO2, that will be 3.5 gram per hectoliter addition. I talk about SO2 addition, we're talking about winemaking. Quality control on the molecular SO2 is later. Okay, so addition of SO2 in the tank with staves, to agitation, racking to a tank, second rack to a buffer tank, back to the tank with the stave. So we make 2 rackings, 24 hours. We eliminate 2 times the heavy lees. That's very important for color stability, because heavy lees here, you know, during malolactic you change pH, some color is precipitating, going down. So those agglomerated color elements are granulate that amplify the color and stability. So we don't have a clean wine like centrifuge. Absolutely not, because with those 2 rackings we keep 99% of the yeast and 99% of the bacteria. So I said, let's suppose Malek is finished this day. So with those 2 rackings we eliminate only the heavy lees. We keep the good lees that we will work with some agitation. If necessary, we add some new active interesting lees at this stage. And then that's a technique I like. If we have, for example, 200 hectoliter, it's much easier to manage that tank 200 hectoliter than 200 hectoliter is 90 barrel, to be simple. Or if you have 225 hectoliter, it's easier to manage one tank like this than 100 barrel. And at the end, we have a more balanced, more fruity wine. What we look from oak, wine, yeast, bacteria interaction, we have it with the staves, with good quality staves. Some staves around the world now, some suppliers give staves that close to barrel quality, from not working the same, of course, but not a second, let's say a second level oak. And that's very interesting to build the fruit. And then we go to barrel. So we'll talk about that. But very quickly, intermediate slide is doses of SO2 at the very end of malolactic. SO2 added, 3.3 pH, 3 gram per hectoliter, added, it's underlined. Because often when I say that, people said, yes, but that professor talks about 25 milligram of free SO2. Free SO2 is quality control. After that, here we start with addition. And then the goal is to keep 0.6, 0.7 molecular SO2 in our Pinot. With low pH, it's easier. Okay. So in Pinot, this is something to forget for me. 3.5, it's not confirming pH for Pinot for international competition and longevity. Okay, continue to work building the colloidal matrix and longevity. We go to barrel, generally with Pinot Noir. If you want and avoid vanilla obvious character, use rather high level of new oak. It's not a paradox. Pinot Noir, if you use used oak, one day in the bottle you have the old style, the old wineries, the old cellar smell. And new oak, well managed, pushes the mineral fruity character. So, for example, 1 batonnage a month, generally rack, interrogation mark, is it necessary or not? Often I would recommend, because many things are occurring in the first month in new oak, because the wine is still very reactive with the lees, etc. So generally that racking to eliminate heavy lees is very interesting. And then after that racking, often until bottling, after 8-9 months in the barrel or 1 year, whatever, often you don't need to make another racking. And that racking is very interesting because then it's your sensory and of course analytical analysis that pilot your agitation. If you leave the heavy lees, if you don't eliminate that, those heavy lees here, you need to, at one moment, you'll be obliged to make stirring once a month, while it would be better to be only every 3 months when you're the last quarter of your Pinot Noir. And then here, that picture with staves, when you take your wine out of the barrels, be careful to go directly to stainless steel without buffering elements. What I recommend, whatever the period in the barrel, when you go out to a tank and you have stainless steel tank in your winery, always put 30-40 grams of staves and noblesse to rebuffer things. If not, you change the system between oak, wine, lees, etc. It's a certain system. If you switch to another system that's very, very different, the wine reacts with more aggressive tannins, more sulfur flavor, more bitterness, etc., etc. So these are general elements that are important, and that's it. Of course, with Pinot, maybe you'll not be surprised, but I would say a sentence, for example, for Cabernet or Merlot. Personally, I've never seen a wine that was adapted with the classical quarter racking, because you see, if that wine, if you rack it after 3 months, often it's too late. Or you don't rack it, or you rack early, and then maybe you don't need it. Okay, the quarter classical Grand Cru racking for Cabernet, okay, is maybe okay for a certain power, certain appellation around the world, but elsewhere it's not that interesting. So it's better to work earlier on that. Here, that racking, we are not eliminating the yeast. Again, we just go, for example, from barrel to one tank one day, then we go back to barrel. So we eliminate what is settling, maybe 1 centimeter. But when the workers say, well, it's not interesting racking because I don't eliminate anything, there's a trick, say, try that. So people say, oh, it's bitter, it's horrible. So try to eliminate those heavy lees. And you keep your yeast and bacteria to go on aging. Okay, that was a little long. That's what I wanted to share with you. Again, the goal, an example where each step we try to eliminate the non-mistakes, and at the end, generally, the wine is more conformed to the dose. Thank you for long patience.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominique. Excellent talk, lots of information. There's now time for a few questions from the audience.
I have a question about extended skin contact with Pinot ferment. If you handpick fruit, not crush, just destemmed, you have a very healthy ferment, normally at least 2 days of a day through the entire process. Are there benefits for, say, 40 to 50 days skin contact for a top-end wine? If your ferment's healthy, your cap's still happy, there's no off orders, nothing. Can you, in a good year, can you continue to leave it on the skins as long as you...
You said 40, 50 days?
40, yeah. I've worked in, when I was last year in Tasmania, the winemaker kept Pinot on the skins for 7 months in an airtight, just for his top end Pinot. He felt that it pulled different characteristics and different personalities into one.
Yeah, it was a Tasmanian devil.
Yeah, I said the same thing, but I was just wondering if there could be benefits.
Well, let's turn it a certain way. My experience with market goals and style, less and less my clients macerate more than 14, 15 days. 50. That's why I asked you again, 40, 50,
yeah.
Or 14, 15. So, because, why? So, on your question, I have another question. Why not to crush? Okay, that's very important. So, with long maceration, I would recommend very, very, very strongly to crush. Why? If not, if you have very good Pinot, whatever variety, very good grapes, they are very solid. So fermentation finishes, and you still have some sugar leaking from an open thing, and your delistage are far less efficient on top of it. But from biological, simple, practical thing, your yeast are dead. Then with co-inoculation, it's another story. But your yeast are dead, and then you have some sugar coming out. So Brettanomyces love that. Pediococcus, Lactobacillus, they love that. If you're pH 335, Inococcus also love that, so they will be quick on the malic, and then they go to sugar. So be careful. We have long extended maceration without crushing. big danger from basic problems. Unless you are on the VA market where people love your wine because of VA, but it's not segment, it's a niche. So first thing. Then if you have open tanks to make punch down, more than 15 days, I guess in Ontario you have small flies, vinegar flies. That's very tough to keep that. Then your caps start to be like this, like that. Then if you put, not joking, you put an Italian name on your label, etc. Almost you add your Pinot Noir, and you make your local Barolo. I'm not joking. With a good Pinot Noir, you can make something more on the style of Barolo, but will be more on the brown style. It can be, but it's a niche in the Pinot Noir. So be careful with very long maceration.
I had a question about we were talking before about adjusting your pH to 3.35 and not worrying about TA. In this area, it's not unusual to have 7.5, 8.5 grams acidity and have a pH of 3.8 to 4.
Yeah.
So, following that logic.
Expressed in tartaric acid?
Yes. Expressed in tartaric acid. So, following that logic, the amount of tartaric acid we have to add to that, the total acidity would be too high. I mean, we're talking about a wine now that's going to have, 10, 11 grams of TA.
Before Malo.
And so Malo's going to pull out 3 grams. I've made a lot of Pinots where the correct acidity runs in about the 7.5 to 8.5 gram per liter range. Now you're telling me to make it essentially in the 11 gram range. I find it hard to believe that that's going to improve my wine from a sensory point of view. I realize it's the same.
I'm not sure it will go to the 11. And then what is important again is pH. If you have 3.8, 3.9 Pinot, you directly go to the soapy character. Last year I had a small country in the center of Europe. Winemaker didn't want to change the pH. It was 3.6. But the winery is spending 2 times more money in the vineyard to get 3.6 ripe Pinot Noir rather than 3.7. And let's say strategy that costs at least in a winery the double of that strategy to get it's a good Pinot Noir. There are some good Pinot Noir at rather high pH, but then on longevity and style, etc., it's another story. So okay, then it was written 345. You can let's negotiate with 340.
I'm just saying.
The question is the worst condition around the world are high pH, high TA, generally because of malic. Then malic is linked with in the grapes with other elements that are aggressive. For longevity point of view, if those grapes you keep high pH, it's a problem. Today I was talking about Pinot Noir. If I talk about other varieties with the same figures in the grapes, the maceration and the bottling goals can be different. Like macerating 3.5, then start aging at 3.5, and then because of the tartaric precipitation, you go to 3.6, 365 in the bottle. Cabernet, Merlot, around the world, like Rhine, whatever. The style when pH during maceration is very, very important.
No, I realize. I'm not sure that what you're saying is possible most years that also have right Pinot Noir in this region, because our problem is always with that particular grape variety. Other ones have more normal numbers, but I can tell you, most years we.
I would recommend.
Like I said, if you're talking about actually adjusting it you're going to end up with a TA that is of the type that is going to make a wine that is not.
Did you try on the fresh crushed grapes? If we talk about adjusting pH, one fermentation is finished with the figures you said. Okay, that would be it. As I said, this procedure is consistent in every action. If you apply what I recommend on pH at the end of fermentation on that's not work. It's not the same. Maceration for Pinot is extremely important. If you make your cold soak at 3.8 pH or 335, 3.8 pH, don't make cold soak. I would recommend go directly 18 centigrade or full fermentation.
But I guess that's my question. I mean, if I'm adjusting that,
Try it.
3 grams. No, but are you? My TA will be 8.5. So you're telling me to go to 11 grams of TA pre-fermentation.
Oh yeah.
And then how much malolactic is going to drop that by how much then?
Depends on your situation, but those situations, that's where people directly see the pH change interest.
Okay, but how much is the pH going to drop? Is the pH going to drop by 3 grams again? Is the TA going to drop by 3 grams through malolactic?
Give me your potassium, your malic, your tartric, then we can start to think.
It seems very high for our situation. We deal with almost everything.
No, it's not. I'm not saying it's a universal procedure, but let's talk about bread. Let's talk about lactobacillus. Let's talk about enococcus. And Pinot Noir, high pH, in those situations, they are generally really soapy. So then you, as I said, some people will say, oh, this is Pinot Noir, so I go back to Cabernet. No, I'm not joking. It's a strategic goal. In Chile, they have excellent Pinot Noir. Some winemakers, you taste the wine and you see, oh, okay, I believe them. It's Pinot Noir because there's Pinot Noir in Chile, but they say I'm made by a Cabernet winemaker.
Maybe time for one more quick question.
Some gentlemen had a question.
My question is about the use of oak. I mean, just adding it up, I was seeing almost 10 grams per liter of oak being used on Pinot, and wow, better start with an awful lot of fruit.
Don't exaggerate. Almost 10. It's
About 5 to
5.
7.
5 is half 10.
No, that's at that point. 5 to 7 at that point, and then we went from.
Total. Yeah, you're right.
Yes,
Yeah. Then the staves. Yes. As I said, Pinot Noir fruit is always. You don't have fruit if you don't have oak in Pinot Noir. Let's put it as simple as that.
I just wonder if I wouldn't have to use so much noblesse if I wasn't adding so much oak.
That's a good question.
I can save money on both fronts.
Yes, but you don't make the same one.
Perhaps.
Good practice is we start with the goal. Yeah, oak and noblesse and pH. Because it's colloidal, people that know cooking, mayonnaise is not just Heinz bottle. It's normally yolk and oil, and you build a colloidal matrix, so and stabilization of things, etc. And maybe on that theme, high oak, or recommended that in an absolute scale, it's Pinot Noir will be the higher dosage of oak. If we have the same conference on Cabernet, big Cabernet, there will be less oak. Cabernet for different reasons. And Pinot Noir, the higher oak, because it's not because it's my idea. Also look at the market, the long-lasting fruity Pinot Noir. We're on the fruity side. The way to reach that, oak during fermentation and during malo, etc., is an interesting thing. And the wine then also will be less aggressive on the barrel. So that's also positive because the wine has been saturated with some elements from oak. Of course, don't use some people, some wineries lose time. They shave their barrel, toast them on the barbecue. Please buy some interesting convection toasted chips or even blocks on the $35 bottle. Blocks will be better than chips because generally coopers give you better things with blocks than chips. And staves, I've seen somebody advertising staves direct fire toasted like barrel. Okay, barrel, we talk about barrel. Barrel is barrel. Stave, in this process, has another mission. So it's not to copy a cheaper barrel on this wine at $35. So some complementary elements on the question. And
I think Bruce.
Do you have any concerns about adding tartaric to finish wine?
Sorry, sir?
Adding tartaric that late? How to avoid adding tartaric to wine? Again, a hardness to adding, I feel, tartaric to wine as opposed to juice. I like to make conditions to the juice. Hopefully not.
Okay, I won't go back, but it's clear. It's somewhere. It's the. Oh, it's true. There's not the arrow. Tartaric is added here.
Right. Do you have on the other side, or do you have just for the SO2?
Oh yeah, that's the adjustment of pH. So here I don't. For example, if you have a very big Pinot, it depends. For example. It happens to me with several clients. We start with my Pinot is okay. Oh, it's a nice one. What is it? 355, 360 pH. Okay, this year in the bottle it will be 345. Not to shock the consumers. And then next year we go to 340. So 335 during maceration. Here with malolactic pH is rising to 355. For first year we say the goal is 345. We readjust pH to 345. Next year, we are after Malo, some wines we readjust to 335. You're not clear. During Malo, pH is rising, so that tartaric is to bring back to the pH goal. It's not an option, tartaric on the grapes or tartaric here. This tartaric usually is a very low amount. It depends where we are. When we have very high potassium grape, most of the potassium has been eliminated with the first tartaric on the grape during cold soak. So here is sometimes it's 0.3 gram, 0.2. You make trials. 0.5. It's very generally very low. I answer your question. Yeah. Here generally it's not massive. It's depends on your malic. But from potassium point of view, that's the big problem for pH management. That's the goal of the first tartaric on the fresh grapes is to change the pH by eliminating potassium. Two very interesting actions. The potassium is soapy, aggressive, and bitter. So here it's just to readjust, and your wine has already very well buffered pH. So it's just a retouch. So sometimes half a gram or 0.3 depends. It's back to a certain pH goal. And let's say if you say, okay, I try what he said, but in the bottle, because maybe today you're 3.7, I go to 3.5. Why not? Here you readjust to 3.5. You go to 355, 360. You go back to 350. Some wines, this style, they go to 335. At this moment, back to 335.
3.5 would be a main addition. That'd be a large addition for here.
On the grapes, yeah. No, I said if commercially your wine is 3.7 and you want to go apply this process and in your bottle be at 3.5 and not at 3.35, that would be commercially a big jump, maybe a big improvement, but be careful. When pH is a big engine on style, of course. So here, if you want to bottle at 3.5, if you're after Malo 3.5, you don't have tartaric. I said if you're generally at 3.7 and you want to be at 3.5, here it will be very high. If you're already 5 years at 3.35, 3.40 in your bottle, here you go back to 3.35, so maybe half a gram, some lot, 0.8, but then there's some action. So tartaric is, when a winery starts to apply this process, this strategy on pH, say Northern Hemisphere, we don't talk about perceived acidity before the 1st of December. And often some winemaker call me and say, oh, want to talk about acidity. Hey, it's 15th of November. No, I'm surprised the way acidity is already, sensory acidity is already integrated, etc. This you can talk. Now, because there are so many actions where the pH change that gives some changes in the style, of course, is integrating the rackings, for example. The heavy lees, sometimes half a centimeter at the bottom. Again, heavy lees, on all those racking, you see agitation racking each time. So you only eliminate what is settling in 24 hours at each time. Those are the EVLs. And there are new EVLs created. Some people say, oh no, I don't do this because I was very careful on the 1st of November racking. Yes, but it's 2 months ago or 3 months ago, depends on the moment. There are some new EVLs created, but not much. Yes, but they're terrible. And from color stability, as I said, the word crystallization is not the right word, but agglomerates of color, like crystals of tartaric growing, they grow colloidally. They are in stabilizing thing.
Okay, well, there's a lot of information. I'd like to remind everybody that this has been videotaped and it will be available on the COVI website by the end of the week. In case you didn't manage to take all the notes, you can watch the video again. With that, I'd like to once again thank Dominique for an excellent lecture, and I'd also like to thank Scott Laboratories for sponsoring this lecture and for sponsoring the videotape. And specifically, I'd like to thank Matisse. So, thanks very much.